Chernobyl is a great introduction to our topic today, which is the environment. I want to link it back to what we were talking about the global economy, because these things are very interlinked together in terms of where we ended and where we are. In the global economy chapter, I might not have told you this, but I'm going to tell it to you now. We had human beings going all over the world. Oh, we were migrating. That's what we also did. We migrated, we immigrated to all different parts of the world. It's a wonderful adaptation that humans have. And we did it by hunting and gathering. We were connected to each other and trading all the time. And human beings were very clever, culturally clever, and they went to places that you probably wouldn't have even imagined human beings could live. Arctic zones and deserts, tropics. In some of those places, they were able to make them habitable through culture, through learned behavior that probably couldn't have been lived in before by human beings. And human beings did all kinds of things to manage their resources. So we know that hunters and gatherers actually have much more complex resource management techniques than we were once aware. They use techniques like fire, burn landscapes, but then to encourage the growth or the regrowth of favored species of deer and things they will hunt, or crops or plants, wild plants that they want to gather. So they're much more involved in resource management than we once thought. And we also developed things like horticulture, small scale domesticated plants and animal production, or in some cases more intensive agriculture, pastoralism, or herding animals. Now, as humans were spreading around, they did modify the environment, and sometimes these things didn't work. There were some intensive agriculture experiments which resulted in desertification. Sometimes irrigation can lead to mosquito growth and malaria, for example. So it wasn't all great. But if you look at about 500 years ago, 1500 AD or CE, depending on how you want to put it, you could probably say that, wow, humans are in all different kinds, parts, places of the world, have figured out how to adapt to those places. They may not all be happy and in abundance at all times, but a lot of different kinds of ways in which humans were using the environment and getting a living from it and adapting to it and adapting it, so that you'd have these pretty successful ways of making a living. And there were some local environmental fails, but for the most part, it was a pretty amazing achievement. And so I say this because one thing that we need to be careful of are the people who say that our current problems or our current crisis or whatever it is we're currently in with regard to the environment are simply the result of the human species. That humans are just bad, and so we naturally destroy the environment everywhere we go. To illustrate this, to bring in Agent Smith from the Matrix. This is Agent Smith, who is one of the, I don't want to spoil it for you, but he is the Matrix, basically, interrogating one of our last humans. So in that example, Agent Smith, who is torturing our hero, says that humans are a virus and that the machines are a cure for the virus because we just multiply wherever we go. Watch out for that, because it actually was not true. It is not true in human history. People were basically being sustainable in various places. Again, there were local fails, but as a whole, it was not happening. The other thing that people blame sometimes the environmental crisis or the crisis of today upon is agriculture. I don't know if you've heard this argument before, but the idea is that when humans started growing crops and intensifying their production of crops, that this led to the downfall of the human. That's led to all the problems that we have today. It is actually most famously exemplified by a person named Jared Diamond, who wrote an article called "The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race." And Diamond was actually, well, we saw Jared Diamond before. Remember in the sexuality chapter, I was getting mad at Jared Diamond being included in there. Not necessarily because of what he said there, although I didn't like that either, but because he's so associated with this idea. And today, you don't have to read the article. You can just go watch this guy on YouTube who'll explain it all to you. And has quite a few views. There you go. The worst mistake in human history, agriculture. Now, the reason you have to watch out for this idea is because, again, it is not technically true. People developed agriculture in many different parts of the world. In some of them, it led to some bad stuff. In others, it was just fine. So the idea that agriculture has caused our problems is suspect, to say the least. Now, one of the reasons we're debating all these things about our current issue is because some scientists, geologists, and others say that we are living in a new era of human life. We are no longer in the Holocene, we're in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene. What's the Anthropocene? That in some ways we've entered a new epoch in which human activity is greater than any other activity and is causing geological changes. And so Guest discusses this with the idea, for example, that we're gonna just build a canal. And so in some ways, we're going to modify the world in ways that is larger than anything that you might say nature does. Now, there's been a lot of debate about when the Anthropocene, are we in the Anthropocene? When did it begin? So some people want to say, well, we began in the Anthropocene 12,000 years ago with the invention of agriculture. And so again, this is the idea that agriculture inevitably leads to the issues that we have now. Again, I'm arguing against that idea. Other people say, well, it started in the 19th century and would point to the Industrial Revolution, the kinds of changes that made possible. Other people would point to the 1950s when you had the first atomic tests. And for those of you who date archaeological artifacts, it's interesting that the time BP or before present is 1950, because after that you have much more radioactive material in the atmosphere. And so the present is taken to be at the time of these atomic tests. Told you Chernobyl is going to be important there. The idea I find most compelling is a study that was put out a few years ago that said that the Anthropocene began in 1610, which is a pretty specific year. But what these scientists said is that that is a year that you can, in some of the records, you can see climate change that they say was brought about basically by transoceanic colonial activity, and that the depopulation of the Americas and the beginning of massive demographic movement, enslavement of people from Africa, resulted in a very different climate. And for me, this is, I would say, the most compelling year, or the most compelling time period for when things started going the way they are. And we talked about some of these things in class. Boy, it's been probably 10 days ago, but what the kinds of things that happened from 1500 to 1900, more or less. And as I was saying, up until around 1500, you had a lot of different and complex things going on in terms of production systems and political and economic systems. But at this time, you start to see, again, people being moved from out of their lands, being compelled to work in on various plantations and industries. And whether or not this should be labeled a deliberate genocide, it was an extreme event in terms of people's population, much of it caused by disease like smallpox, but in some ways caused by the fact that people were put into new and worse laboring conditions than they'd ever been in, and their livelihoods were so disrupted. One of the things that justified this conquest and exploitation was the idea that people who were hunting and gathering were not being efficient. They were not using the land in an efficient way, and they were not actually what people called, they were not working the land. And so this is actually still a concept that appears with us to this day. The idea was that the land should belong to the people who are working it in an agricultural way. And so by this notion, the peoples who were indigenous really didn't belong on the land or weren't using it the right way. The idea about imposing more industrial style agriculture was that they're not using the land in an efficient way, and we're going to make it more efficient. It turns out that that idea is not the case, but we'll talk about that in a second. So during this time, you saw a lot of mining industry. We talked in the global economy chapter about the mines of Potosi. It's starting to really take a lot of silver and minerals out of the land. And you also see the rise of plantation agriculture. And this is really the precursor to industrial agriculture in many ways, because you had the land being worked to basically by people who formed a human-powered machine on the land itself and monocropped the land in a way that was going to produce more and more, in this case, for the most part, sugar, but also coffee and tea and those kinds of things. And the plantations especially that's where, as we talked about, that's where the most people from Africa were onto plantations to produce sugar. And it really was a very deadly enterprise. It's not that everybody died, obviously not, but it was very devastating both to Africa and the places in Africa where people were taken from, but also in the conditions in which they were put in the Americas was pretty rough. We talked about how that the Industrial Revolution that we know so much about was really built on these kinds of the resources of the mines and the plantations that had already been established. And some anthropologists have argued that those mines and plantations were actually a template for how the working classes would be treated in Europe and the United States, but they were also the fuel for it. The money and the sugar was also the fuel, the literal calories that the working classes began to consume. So up until about the 1950s, the result of this is that people in the United States and Europe, what we might call the West, assumed that other people were doing their thing. At best, maybe they were inefficient. They weren't working the land properly, or they just didn't know what they were doing. If they knew what they were doing, they'd get a tractor. People also claimed that other people, if land was commonly held, that it was other people or indigenous societies which might overuse the land. So there's this idea that emerged. It was called the tragedy of the commons. And the idea is that if you have land or a forest or a lake and everybody has access to it, it is held in common, then everyone will have an individual incentive to just take out more and more. And so the idea was that people couldn't manage their resources if they were held in common. You had to privatize it in order to make people use the land and resources more efficiently. And if you didn't, they were just going to ruin it all. Now, anthropology comes along around this time and specializes in telling a slightly different story, which is to say that anthropologists would go to these places and instead of trying to give them tractors, would say, wait a second, people in these areas, people who are indigenous, actually do have skills and knowledge of the land, and they have what we might say are sustainable social agreements. Instead of a tragedy of the commons, what you actually have is evidence that people are able to cooperate and talk with each other about the use of their resources. At the time, even among the anthropologists during this time, anthropology was trying to document these things, but everybody believed that these places were going away, that indigenous peoples would soon be gone, or at least their ways of life would be gone, and that they were going to be subsumed into the Western world. And so there was a prevalent belief throughout the world, you might say, that science and industrialization would bring development to everyone, that we'd have better and better lives, the more nuclear reactors we put in, the more oil that we drilled. And so the idea was that all around the world, everybody should modernize or develop and do it through oil and electricity and all things that we love so much today. And we were talking about Trinidad in the last class. That was actually one of the first places, the first oil wells drilled in the Western Hemisphere. It's one of the reasons that's a relatively wealthy place, is because they have oil. But the idea was we could all do this. We could all become modern and developed through adapting these things. Now, it turns out that the things that are more inefficient, that are possibly inefficient and stupid, are actually the idea that we should privatize everything and extract things for profit from these areas. It's actually industrial agriculture, which turns out to be not worth it, or not the best for the environment as well as efficiency. And so what we see as we look around the world at some of these places, like the mines of Potosi, for example, which right now is an environmental disaster, or the places that were once sugar plantations, which are often in ruins as well, or places where there was once what they call the Rust Belt, where there were once these industrial enterprises that were often very polluting to the environment. Well, this was often and first felt on places which were the lands of indigenous people and the places where this extraction was first visited and first occurred. And so in order to have the things that we have today, there has been and continues to be an incredible displacement of people and their resources. And several of you rightly signaled the story of Banara, just documented in a book called Consuming Ocean Island, Stories of People and Phosphate, Banaba, by Katerina Martina Taylor. And just had to completely remove it. Life is hard for many people. Oh my God, these people just got totally removed from their lands in order to get phosphate for fertilizer. Mm-hmm. So this is probably an extreme case, but it's not the only case in which the local opinions and ideas and whatever people were doing there before have been ignored and basically paved the place and make it uninhabitable. And so Gus tells us that we have these root causes of the place where we're at, and we know what those root causes are, but we also now have some ideas about how to address or criticize those kinds of perspectives. And so what I want to bring out here is we all know about environmentalism and the movements that emerged in the 1960s, but there's been a long-standing critique of capitalist for-profit extractive enterprises, which comes from indigenous societies and those who are allied to them. And what you might say is amazing is that certainly a lot of people have died, and a lot of people got moved, and a lot of people got displaced. But the idea that indigenous people were all going to be displaced, or they were all going to disappear, and that everyone was going to adopt industrial capitalism has actually not turned out to be as true as they thought it was. And in fact, a lot of people are looking for slightly different solutions to our issues by turning back to indigenous ideas or the knowledge that people have in their local environments. Actually, let's say, Mathila, what are people trying to do now? I would say that even there are people who are trying to do this in our own country as well, but in some cases we see this more often in different places. So it's the idea of being able to combine local or indigenous knowledges with modern technologies in order to get different outcomes. And it's not trying to necessarily say that people, not trying to go back to so-called primitive way of life, but to look to the people who know these environments the best for ways to move forward in them. So that is one hopeful thing that's going on. A number of you found hope. He cites this book by Donna Haraway called Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Thulacine. I have no idea what that means, but the idea is we're trying to think about how we are entwined with other species. Another person who guest cites, we saw before, and he talks about Helmrich's work and in a similar way. Says, by imagining for a moment life without humans, or life in which humans are deeply enmeshed with other non-human life, can we also imagine a new collective entangled future that can move us beyond our current environmental destruction? So the idea is here is instead of thinking about humans as separate and above and outside of the natural world, thinking about how that world works and how we are enmeshed with it, maybe. Some of you are also drawn to the idea of ecotourism. Yeah, it can be helpful. So ecotourism is, for one thing, it is potentially a better form of travel than simply tourism. So it's possible that it's a less destructive form of travel, which can be quite environmentally harsh. It's also possible that it wakes people up to what is going on. If you're going to see a disappearing glacier, you might think, or a coral reef, you might start to think about the world differently. I will say that there are people who are pretty critical of ecotourism because some of them just slap a label on going somewhere and do basically the same thing as tourism. And the other thing that some people are critical of is like, if everybody's flying out to see that last glacier go away, like the carbon emissions to go see it are only increasing the problem. Now, I don't want to get down on it because it has potential, but there are some critical perspectives on this. It's better than nothing, I would say. People are probably going to do tourism anyway. I don't think it's necessarily going to solve problems, but I don't think it's exacerbating problems. Guest argues here for a sense of urgency. He says that time is short for our planet and the other species with which we live. I quoted this to you, and that's scary. Some of you were drawn to the Maldives. Maldives. Yeah, I'm going to say Maldives. I just said Maldives, but now I want to say Maldives. Yeah, this is a place where they are very threatened by climate change because they live on a small island. And so they're trying to convince us that we should all go to a net zero future, and they're committed to that. There's a slight problem, though, if you live on a small island like this and you are committed to carbon neutral. What's the problem? Yes. Let us say you're on a small island. You're like, I'm cool. I'm committed to carbon neutrality. Got it all made. We're going to be fine here.
You can only make so much impact. I'm going to say it's not enough.
If the rest of the world doesn't follow suit, then whatever happens in your little island, that's the problem. You will not make it. I don't know if I can make it much longer. Our incoming president has promised more than 200 things that he's going to do on day one. So some people have counted up what he says the most he's going to do. I was surprised by what he said. The number one thing that he says he's going to do on day one is about education. He's going to cut funds to schools that teach
Like terrible, like I hate it.
critical race theory and transgender insanity. The second thing is the largest deportation operation in American history. And the third thing is, so what we're really talking about in today's class is the environmental aspect, which I don't know if electric cars are the answer to anything. Repeal Biden's electric vehicle mandate.
What does that mean?
What does that mean exactly? There is no electric vehicle
You
mandate.
said it 31
I thought that we
times. I
had
was
switch
just
all
saying it
electric
31
by 2050 something.
It's an idea. There's certainly not a mandate. Anyway, I don't know what exactly is going to happen here because there isn't an electric vehicle mandate, but something is going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen here because it's actually hard to do this without legislative action. This one, I will just say, a lot of people do not realize how they probably are going to try this one. So buckle up.